The moment you realize the cage has been locked is the moment you finally stop pretending the bars aren't there. But for most of humanity, that realization will come exactly 7 days too late. Welcome back to the Awakened Seal. We are standing at the terminal edge of the world as you know it, a point where the geopolitical friction of 2026 and the metaphysical laws of cause and effect are about to collide in a spectacular display of systemic entropy that the ancient texts called the Tribulation, yet today's elite call the Great Reset of Sovereignty. To understand the first 7 days of this epic is to understand the ultimate bait-and-switch operation ever conducted on a planetary scale. Because the horror of the tribulation does not begin with fire and brimstone, but with the most intoxicating, seductive lie ever whispered into the ear of a panicked species, the promise of peace and safety. Imagine waking up tomorrow to a world where the noise has suddenly stopped, where the digital grid is humming but the voices you expect to hear are gone, and in that vacuum of absolute terror, a single frequency begins to broadcast a solution so perfect, so logical, and so charismatic that your survival instinct will scream at you to bow down and worship the hand that holds the leash. This is not a drill. It is the structural collapse of the old world order to make room for a predator that has been groomed in the shadows of our financial institutions and diplomatic corridors for decades. When we look at the first day of this 7-year cycle, we are looking at the signing of a covenant that is less of a peace treaty and more of a spiritual and economic merger, a document that effectively liquidates national borders in exchange for a simulated stability centered in the most volatile zip code on the planet, Jerusalem. You see, the Antichrist does not arrive as a monster with horns, but as the ultimate CEO, a technocratic savior who manages to solve the Middle East problem through a masterpiece of legal and political engineering that involves the Temple Mount, a site that serves as the literal and figurative anchor of global consciousness. By brokering a deal that allows for the reconstruction of the Jewish temple, he isn't just building a house of worship, he is installing a global operating system that synchronizes the religious, political, and financial ambitions of a broken world, and the masses will weep with joy because they are tired of the wars, tired of the inflation, and tired of the uncertainty of the mid-2020s. But beneath this veneer of diplomatic miracle lies the opening of the first seal, represented by the rider on the white horse, a figure who mimics the purity of a savior but carries a bow without arrows, symbolizing a conquest achieved through psychological warfare, soft power, and the weaponization of consensus. This rider is the personification of the Hegelian Dialectic. Create the chaos, which in this case is the sudden, jarring disappearance of millions in the rapture, and then provide the synthesis, which is this new global covenant. The economic shockwaves of the Great Exit will have left the global markets in a state of absolute cardiac arrest, with planes falling from the sky and power grids flickering as the salt of the earth is removed, leaving behind a decaying corpse of a civilization that is ripe for the picking. By day 2 and day 3, the euphoria of the peace covenant begins to bleed into a darker reality as the second seal is cracked open, releasing the rider on the red horse who is granted the authority to take peace from the earth, proving that any stability built on a lie is inherently entropic. This isn't just about conventional warfare, it's about the fracturing of the human psyche where neighbors turn against neighbors because the scarcity of truth has become more lethal than the scarcity of bread. As we analyze the social survival aspect of these first 72 hours, we must recognize that the Great Deception is funded by the Great Default, where the fiat currencies we've spent our lives chasing are revealed to be nothing more than digital dust in the face of a cosmic judgment that demands a different kind of currency, your soul. The rider on the red horse wields a great sword, which in our modern context translates to the absolute polarization of society, the weaponization of identity, and the surgical removal of any dissenting voices that refuse to acknowledge the new architect of order. Simultaneously, the heavenly realm is in a state of judicial activity that mirrors the earthly chaos, with the Lamb, the only one with the legal standing to judge the creation, systematically dismantling the protections that have kept human evil in check for millennia. This is the law of karma, or more accurately, the law of divine justice, where the collective rejection of truth for centuries finally hits the confirm button on the consequences. While the media in Jerusalem and Washington, D.C. broadcasts images of the Antichrist and the 10-nation coalition standing in unity, the third rider on the black horse is already saddling up, preparing to introduce a global hyperinflation that will make the 2022 to 2025 period look like an era of abundance. We are talking about a quart of wheat for a day's wages, a world where the price of survival is so high that the average citizen will be forced to choose between their hunger and their heritage. This economic strangulation is the ultimate tool of social control, as it forces the population into a centralized digital ID system just to access the calories needed to see day 7. Yet, in the midst of this darkening sky, there is a flicker of a different kind of light. The emergence of the two witnesses in the streets of Jerusalem, two figures who operate outside the laws of physics and the jurisdiction of the New World government. They are the glitch in the Antichrist's perfect system, the anomaly that cannot be patched or deleted, and their presence serves as a terrifying reminder to the global elite that their new age is actually just an old rebellion reaching its terminal velocity. Their voices will cut through the static of the globalist propaganda, calling out the covenant for the death warrant it truly is. And while the world will learn to hate them with a demonic intensity, their invincibility during the first half of the week will be the ultimate psychological torment for a world that thought it had finally silenced God. We are entering a period where the unseen becomes the only reality that matters, where your bank account is a liability, and your spiritual alignment is your only asset. As the first week progresses, the pale horse of the fourth seal begins to loom on the horizon, ready to claim a quarter of the world's population through a synergistic collapse of food chains, medical systems, and civil order, a statistic so staggering that the human mind will likely shut down to avoid the sheer weight of the trauma. If you think the current global tensions are peak intensity, you are failing to account for the supernatural acceleration that occurs when the restrainer is removed and the full weight of human depravity is allowed to run its course without a safety net. This is the anatomy of a world that chose a king of its own making over the King of Kings, and the first 7 days are merely the introductory chapter of a lesson that will cost the earth everything it holds dear. The transition from day 3 to day 4 marks the point where the peace mask begins to slip, revealing the fangs of a global tyranny that has been waiting in the tall grass of history since the Tower of Babel. You need to understand that the Antichrist's rise is not a political accident. It is the culmination of a multi-generational grooming of the human consciousness to accept a unified field of governance that excludes the divine. Every crisis we have endured in the last decade has been a stress test for this very moment, a way to calibrate the masses to respond to fear with a demand for centralized authority. When the 144,000 Jewish evangelists are sealed and sent out, they represent the ultimate counterinsurgency, a spiritual special forces unit that will operate behind enemy lines to pull as many people as possible out of the wreckage before the final format disk command is issued to the planet. This is the ultimate war of frequencies, the deceptive low-vibration signal of the Antichrist versus the high-frequency, uncompromising truth of the sealed servants of the Most High. As the first half of this prophetic week begins to solidify, the world will find itself trapped in a paradox of high-tech utopia and primitive visceral suffering, where the smart cities of the future become the gilded cages of a population that traded its freedom for a temporary fix for their fear. But the most chilling realization of all is that for many, the first 7 gay will be the most normal part of the end. A deceptive calm before the atmospheric pressure drops, and the real storm of the Great Tribulation begins to tear the fabric of reality apart. The question is not whether you can survive the economics or the politics of this period, but whether you have the internal fortitude to recognize the lie when it's wrapped in the flag of global unity and human progress. We are moving into the deep waters now, where the shadows of the fifth and sixth seals are already beginning to stretch across the collective human psyche, and what lies ahead in the second half of our analysis will challenge everything you think you know about the limits of human endurance and the reach of divine wrath. Stay focused, because the architecture of the end is much more complex than the headlines suggest. And the next phase of this unsealing will reveal the true cost of the Great Deception in ways that will leave the world screaming for the mountains to fall on them. As we prepare to pivot from the diplomatic theater of the first 3 days into the raw, unbridled cataclysms that define the middle of the week, you must realize that the white horse has already passed you by. The red horse is already breathing down your neck, and the scales of the black horse are being calibrated as we speak. This is the moment where the awakened are separated from the distracted, and the reality of the coming days will be a fire that either refines you or consumes you, and I am here to make sure you see the flames before they reach your door. We have only scratched the surface of this 7-day descent, and the transition into the 4th day marks the beginning of a metabolic collapse of the global system that will redefine the word survival for every man, woman, and child left on this spinning marble. Are you ready to see what happens when the mask of peace is torn off to reveal the face of the pale rider? If you have the stomach for the truth of the 4th through the 7th day, then we must go deeper into the belly of the beast, for the real revelation is just beginning to unfold. You spent your life building a bunker to survive a war. But how do you survive a world that has decided it no longer wants you to breathe its air? Welcome back to the Awakened Seal. We are now crossing the threshold of Day 4, a temporal marker where the thin veneer of the Antichrist's New World Order begins to dissolve into a viscous, inescapable nightmare that the elite have pre-sold to you as necessary stabilization, but which the cosmic ledger records as the 4th seal. If the first 3 days were about the psychological and economic capture of humanity, Day 4 is the beginning of the metabolic collapse of the planetary system, embodied by the rider on the pale horse whose name is Death, followed closely by Hades. You must understand the linguistic nuance here, for the Greek word chloros describes a sickly, ashen green, the color of vegetation that has lost its life force and the color of a corpse in the advanced stages of decomposition. This is not just a horseman. It is a frequency of absolute systemic failure that permeates the air, the water, and the very biology of the survivors. In the high-tech corridors of Silicon Valley and the fallout shelters of Kansas, the realization begins to dawn that no amount of encrypted currency or hydroponic systems can shield a man from the great sword, hunger, and death by the beasts of the earth that now claim 25% of the global population. This 25% is not a mere statistic. It is the liquidation of 2 billion souls in a time frame so compressed that the logistics of grief will be replaced by the logistics of mass disposal. As a survivalist, you know that when the supply chains snap, society is only 9 meals away from total anarchy. But by Day 4 of the Tribulation, we are talking about the total evaporation of the social contract where the beasts of the earth, whether they be literal apex predators emboldened by human weakness or microscopic biological agents engineered in the labs of the shadow government, begin to harvest the fearful. The Antichrist's administration will likely frame this as a population optimization or a tragic side effect of the Great Transition, using his masterful control of the narrative to convince the remaining 3/4 that their only hope for safety is even deeper integration into his centralized grid. Yet, while the Earth groans under the weight of the Pale Rider, a shift occurs in the atmospheric resonance of the planet as we move toward Day 5 and the opening of the 5th seal, which reveals a hauntingly beautiful and terrifying reality under the heavenly altar. Here we see the souls of those who were slaughtered for the word of God and the testimony they held, and unlike the passive observers of the modern age, these souls are crying out with a loud voice, demanding to know how long the sovereign Lord will wait to avenge their blood. This is the martyr's frequency, a spiritual signal that proves the Antichrist's peace is actually a high-efficiency meat grinder designed to eliminate anyone whose internal vibration is tuned to the truth rather than the lie. To the analysts of human behavior, this is the ultimate purge, the removal of the non-compliant elements that refuse to accept the digital mark or the spiritual branding of the new regime. You must see the irony here. While the world celebrates its newfound unity, the most precious and resilient human beings are being hunted like animals, creating a spiritual vacuum on Earth that is being filled with a density of evil that hasn't been seen since the days of Noah. However, do not mistake this for a defeat, for the white robes given to these martyrs are symbols of a spiritual sovereignty that the Antichrist can neither grant nor take away. As we approach day 6, the very fabric of the material world begins to tear at the seams, and the hard reset of the physical plane commences with a global earthquake so massive that every mountain and island is moved out of its place. Imagine the tectonic plates of the earth being treated like a deck of cards, shuffled by a divine hand, where the skyscrapers of New York and the luxury bunkers of New Zealand are rendered into tombs of twisted steel and useless concrete in a matter of seconds. This is the moment when the survival of the richest theory is proven to be a pathetic delusion, as the kings of the earth, the great men, the rich men, and the commanders, the very architects of the great deception, are seen fleeing into the caves and the rocks of the mountains, not to hide from a political enemy or a nuclear fallout, but to hide from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. Think about that paradox. The wrath of the Lamb. A lamb is the ultimate symbol of innocence and vulnerability, yet here, the frequency of that innocence becomes a crushing weight of judgment that the guilty cannot endure. The sky recedes like a scroll being rolled up, and the stars of heaven fall to the earth like late figs blown by a gale, a description that suggests either a literal celestial bombardment or the collapsing of the dimensional barriers that have kept the spiritual and physical realms separate for eons. The elite, with all their satellite arrays and deep underground military bases, DUMBs, will suddenly realize that their secret hideouts are nothing more than pre-dug graves, as the literal foundations of the world they tried to rule are liquefied by the frequency of divine holiness. By day 7, the world is no longer debating whether God exists or if the Bible is true. The evidence is written in fire across the heavens and felt in the trembling of every bone in the human body. The global economy is a memory. The digital grid is a flickering ghost, and the Antichrist's charisma is revealed to be nothing more than the desperate hiss of a cornered predator. Yet, in this absolute darkness, the 144,000 Jewish evangelists emerge as the ultimate counterinsurgency, moving through the chaos with a supernatural immunity that defies every law of the New World physics. They are the awakened seal in its purest form, carrying a message that is no longer about religion, but about the brutal, beautiful reality of the king who is coming to reclaim his territory. They operate in the ruins of Jerusalem and the debris of the global hubs, pulling a great multitude out of the fire. People from every nation, tribe, and tongue who finally realize that they were sold a lie and are now willing to wash their robes in the blood of the Lamb. This is the ultimate survival strategy. Not the hoarding of grain or the sharpening of steel, but the total surrender of the ego to the only power that can navigate a soul through the dissolution of the universe. The first 7 in Gay are the birthing pains of a new reality, a period where the false self is stripped away so that the eternal self can finally see the light. You are not watching a movie. You are watching the calibration of your own eternity, and as the dust settles on the first week of the tribulation, the choice between the mark of the beast and the seal of the living God will be the only binary code that matters. The world you knew is gone, the world you feared is here, and the only way out is through the fire. You have been warned, you have been informed, and now, as the shadows of the 7th day lengthen into the great tribulation, You must decide if you are a citizen of the falling empire or a herald of the coming kingdom. The seal is broken, the clock is at 0, and the king is no longer waiting at the door. He is kicking it down. Choose your frequency, for the vibration of this week will echo forever.